we made a very important decision backstage. We're not wearing jackets today.
A little warm.
It's just too damn hot. Thank you all so much. And thank you for the festival. I say this, I do a couple of events for the festival each and every year. People shouldn't take this for granted. Not every city has this. This is a really remarkable festival, and I hope that you support it and you get a chance to see a lot of the things that they're doing, take part in a lot of these ideas events. I want to thank the International Festival of Arts and Ideas for always being such a good host to us. I'd also like to thank some sponsors quickly: the Mohegan Tribe, Connecticut Business and Industry Association, Eversource, Clifton Larson Atlin, the Causeway Agency, Express Strategies, Hinckley Atlin, and Rowthorne Law. If you're sitting here in the audience, you also have little cards with a QR code. If you want to take a look at that, that's a way that you can sign up for Connecticut Mirror newsletters and also support the Connecticut Mirror. I'll be telling you more about that because once a public radio fundraiser, always a public media fundraiser. So I'll keep doing that. Erick Russell, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start here. There's a lot that we want to talk about, but we ask our members for questions in advance. And overwhelmingly, most of the questions we got were about one issue. And most of the people who are here in this audience want to talk about one very particular issue. So let's talk about the state's investments in Israel.
Sure.
What exactly is in the state of Connecticut's portfolio that's in your control that are investments in the actual state of Israel?
Sure. So thank you for the question, and thank you for many of the folks here in the audience that have posed the questions and that I've had conversations with over my time in office up to this point. And I want to start by just acknowledging the gravity of this issue and my understanding of how strongly people feel about it and what we're witnessing and the devastation that we're seeing, and how gut-wrenching that is. And so that is not lost on me at all. To be very clear, right, my top priority as treasurer is to maximize returns for pensioners. And that ultimately guides decisions that we are making on the investment front to get the best risk-adjusted returns for our state employees and our teachers and our retirees. And that has been my focus coming in. We have investments in Israel. They probably total, and this varies day to day, but probably close to $100 million in total out of our $56 billion portfolio. The only two direct investments that we have are in two bonds that were purchased kind of on a legacy front before I was in office that are set to mature in 2025 and 2026. The rest of our investments are passive. So they are through managers that ultimately have flexibility as they're making investment decisions with the goal of getting those strong returns for pensioners. And I am often confronted with the pressure to either invest in something or divest from a host of different things. We have these conversations around climate, right? Or companies that have poor labor practices. And we do a lot of work engaging with folks on that front because it is critical. And as we talk about many of these things, they're not disconnected from our goal of getting returns, strong returns for pensioners, because it's ultimately about analyzing risk as we are making investment decisions. But anytime that we are making a decision to completely divest from anything, there is a lot of work and process and time that goes into that. Often federal guidance. There's an organization called the Office of Foreign Asset Controls that really guides a lot of policy or sanctions around other countries. And we look at all of those things in totality as we make those decisions.
Could you give me an example of how exactly that works? So, for instance, whether or not it's the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine or some other international act, what sort of guidance do you get from this national organization that tells you what to do or what not to do with your investments?
Yeah, so ultimately it's their sanction list, and their list of countries say that we can or should not invest in. So that may be Iran, it may be Sudan. Many of those things we take up through the legislature here in Connecticut. So if the state is going to take the position that we are not investing in a country, the legislature would take that up and would pass that in policy. There's some policies that have come directly out of the office. Russia was one of them. And part of that was, again, in this fiduciary context around the idea that assets in Russia would be frozen and would ultimately be really harmful to pensioners. And so
So this is risk management on your part, right?
100%.
This has to do with you deciding it's too risky for the state of Connecticut right now to be invested in Russia. And so I'm going to make that unilateral decision to do so.
It's not all unilateral. Again, it depends on the situation. One unilateral example was our policy around divestment from civilian gun manufacturers, for example. This was done under Treasurer Wooden. And it was a policy, again, after a lot of legwork, determining that one, this was not going to be harmful to pensioners. It wasn't going to impact our ability to get strong risk-adjusted returns. And it was such a small portion of our portfolio at any point that we were able to go through that analysis to determine that it was that was going to be a long-term benefit for us.
How small a part of the portfolio was that when it was divested?
I don't know the exact dollar amount, but civilian gun manufacturers is a very small part of the market compared to many of the, when you think about some of these other large.
I think you can anticipate my next question is what was it in comparison to how much we are invested in Israel currently?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact answer to that. What I can speak to, again, is the direct investments that we have. We've had some. So, for example, we had a bond that matured last year while I was in office. A lot of times those bonds would have been re-upped and we would have purchased another Israeli bond. There's a lot of pressure to do that as well, right? My position in the office is that decisions that we are making on the investment front are going to be about what is best for pensioners. And we are going to continue to let that guide us. And if we get, policy or direction from either the federal government or the state legislature, then we obviously would go through that process.
Okay, so just a couple more questions about this. You say that the state's investments in Israel predate you being in office. You've not been in office that long. Why are we invested in the state of Israel, and are we invested in other state actors? Do we have bonds in other countries?
So these were carved out. The bonds were initially purchased through a manager. And this was a unique situation in which that manager ultimately left our portfolio. So we aren't working with that manager anymore, but those bonds are still sitting until they mature. So they're kind of in their own bubble. We invest in a lot of other countries, but those are all done through managers that are out there that have flexibility to determine how they're going to make investments with the goal of getting strong returns for our pensioners. And so, there is flexibility on the part of managers to make those purchases. But that is part of the reason why I chose not to re-up this bond that had matured, because we kind of had this separate carve out that I didn't think was best suited for our portfolio.
Do you think that moving forward, it's in the best interest of the state of Connecticut to have investments in foreign countries where there's so little control we have over the stability of those countries, over the elections in those countries? We see how governments can change like that.
Absolutely.
And like that, they go from stable places that have wide support from the international community to unstable places that do not have wide support. So do you think that that's the sort of business we should be in?
I think we need to factor all of those risks in as we're making decisions, which we do, right? With any foreign investments that we're making, there is a very robust due diligence process that is very much centered on that focus. But we are global investors, right? What that does is protect and insulate our pensioners in the event of a downturn. I mean, if we were solely invested our $56 billion portfolio in just U.S. assets, we could hit a spot where that could be really detrimental to pensioners long-term. As long-term investors, we are thinking about getting returns over market cycles, right? We're not thinking about just returns on an annual basis. And what that has to do is there's a lot of opportunity in other countries that are developing and growing. There are a lot of opportunities in businesses in many of these other countries that may have really innovative products or technology that are doing incredibly well. And so we need to be open-minded about how we're doing that, but we need to make sure that we are factoring in those risks as we're making investment decisions.
Could an argument be made that because of the situation going on in Gaza right now, because of truly the split international community response to Israel and Palestine, given some of the problems internally in that government, that it's every bit as risky to be invested in Israel right now for pensioners in Connecticut as it would be to invest in Vladimir Putin's Russia?
I think that you can certainly look at risk factors. I don't know that those two things are equivalent, but I also know that this is why we use managers for certain investments, right? And certain investment decisions that have expertise in these specific areas, in these specific markets, and are going to factor in those risks when making those decisions.
Do you think that it was a good idea for Connecticut to divest from gun manufacturers?
From civilian gun manufacturers, yes.
Tell me why.
Because ultimately, one, the state has taken a very clear position and has led the charge on gun reform, right? And I think what that has said is it's a signal about where the legislature is on this policy. I also think that from a risk perspective, as we've seen many civilian gun manufacturers being sued, having significant losses, those are all risks for us as an investor as well. And so I think from a long-term perspective, we also know the cost of gun violence on our communities, which again are factoring kind of big picture risk for our state. And at the end of the day, I think we can access similar investments that are much more beneficial to our state with the same return and risk profile.
And certainly do not take this as a criticism of that position, because it seems very sensible to me. However, that does seem like a political calculation. It does seem like because Connecticut has said, look, we are going to take a position on gun violence in America, in large part because of the horrible atrocities that visited us here in the state, that we're going to do something about it. And we're using this lever, as well as a lot of other levers, to try to do something about that. It does feel like it's a political calculation in a certain way. I understand that it very well may mitigate risk for pensioners as well, but that's not the only reason we did it, right?
Well, I think it's a combination. And I think the legislature has taken positions on this many times over. I think from an investment perspective, it's not just about risk. It's about whether or not you're able to get that same return profile with less risk, right? And so those factors were made. But again, there was a lot of analysis before that policy was put in place to make sure that it was going to be in the best interest of pensioners, not just to drive good policy.
So we also got a lot of questions about this from people in advance. Will you consider divesting state pension funds from fossil fuel companies and companies that create infrastructure for extracting and transporting fossil fuels? The state has taken, a pretty firm stance about climate change. Some people wish to take a firmer stance about climate change, but do you think that that's something that the state should do?
So when we talk about divestment, I think one thing to kind of take a step back on and to really think about the purpose of divestment, because I think it's become this really trendy topic where it's used a lot. But if the goal of divestment is so if we're talking about fossil fuels, for example, if the goal is to say we're going to have a cleaner environment, we are going to reduce the amount of fossil fuel that's being used, divestment is not going to help move the needle forward on that issue. Because all it's going to do right now, while we are still incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, if we divest, someone else is going to pick that investment up and the business is still going to thrive, and pensioners are not going to get returns off of those investments, but they will in many other states. What we've chosen to do is to be very actively engage with companies that we are investing in. And what do I mean by that? It's by being invested in many of these companies, you have a seat at the table. You have the ability to use your voice, use the fact that you are invested in these companies, and leverage that, right, in the direction that the company is going. And so American Pacific, for example, was a company that we were invested in. They had 12 coal plants that were open and part of their business. We engaged with them over time, and through that engagement, got them to agree to a plan where they were going to, where they agreed to close those coal plants over time. All 12 of those coal plants have now been closed, and we were able to accomplish that through that engagement. What we're also able to do through that engagement in those investments is get companies that may be doing work in fossil fuels right now, but they're investing in the energy transition space, which is both beneficial to pensioners because obviously that is the direction that we're moving in, but we're also able to encourage and particularly when we're working collaboratively with other states, with other treasurers, to put more weight behind efforts to move folks in the right direction. And it's part of the reason why, from a political perspective, you've seen so much pushback on this ESG wave, right? I think it's become this really political kind of wedge issue.
Yeah, and just say what ESG means for people who don't know.
Yeah, so it's environmental, social, and governance factors that you look at when making investment decisions. And for me, what it's ultimately about is analyzing risk. All of these things are risk profiles. If you have a company that has poor labor practices, that is doing wrong by their employees, that is interfering with their ability to organize, right? that is a risk for that company in terms of its long-term success. It's the same thing if folks have poor environmental practices or if they don't have strong corporate governance. And by engaging on those issues, by analyzing that risk, it allows us to make more informed decisions.
I've certainly talked to a lot of environmental activists over the years about this issue. And what they say, I think, and they would say in response to that is, but you're still investing in the company. You're still essentially saying, we believe that we should put our hard-earned dollars, Connecticut's hard-earned dollars, behind this effort. And just like we wouldn't want to invest in a company that has poor labor practices, if they've shown that they have poor practices when it comes to taking care of our environment or spewing, toxic gases into the air, it seems as though we might not want to be in business with those folks, even if we have some marginal seat at the table that allows us to sit there and say, you should change this.
And to be very clear, I mean, we go through a very robust ESG due diligence process with any company that we're investing in. And we ask questions about anything they're doing on this front. So this is not just a blind, we're investing in companies because it's just about dollars. We are factoring in all of those risks when we make investment decisions. But my point is, once we make a decision to invest in a company, there is this ability to move the needle. I think the other piece is that there's no standard for disclosure around many of these movements right now, right? So if we're looking at where we're investing and you say things that are impacting the climate, there's no standard view of how many, what folks are doing for carbon emissions or how much they're putting out. And what we really need is disclosure is the big piece of this. And we need standard disclosure. We need guidance from the SEC about how we're measuring these things so that we are all looking at it from the same perspective. And then I think it would be a lot easier for us to set a target for at a point where that we would be fully divested from fossil fuels. I think right now it's very easy for me to make that commitment because there's no way of actually knowing how you're going to deliver that, because there's no way currently to measure that in a meaningful way.
When you take a look at the portfolio of the state of Connecticut, this is just personally, this is not, something that you're going to do as part of your job, but do you ever look and say, oh God, I wish this was different. I wish we weren't invested there. Like just something that personally hits you and says, God, I don't like my job today because I have to deal with this particular thing.
I don't know that I've thought about it that way.
Really?
In terms of any specific, I mean, I think there are spaces, and I think part of this coming in and knowing that there are areas that we can improve on. One thing I talked about during the campaign trail was looking at a policy around for-profit prison, right, or like the prison industrial complex. I think these are things that I'm certainly open to looking at. My focus right now is in coming in when I did that there was a large focus on our opportunity to perform better big picture as a pension fund. And that was my top priority coming in, which is what I really set my focus on from the very beginning. We worked closely with the governor and the legislature to pass legislation to make sure we could make improvements around recruiting and retaining talent in the office. We strengthened our investment advisory council. We set a new asset allocation that we're in the right process of right sizing. We brought on some incredible members of the team. So there's so much work that we're doing on that front to make sure, again, as we're thinking about why this is important, this is about saving taxpayer dollars and making sure that our pensions are shored up for state employees and teachers and retirees. And as a state, we went a long time without meeting our commitments to folks. We went about 70 years without properly funding our pensions. And we've made such incredible progress both on the funding side and we're starting to really see improvement on the performance side, which has been great. There's still so much more work to do, but that has really been my primary focus coming in.
So maybe you can explain for folks who don't know what the treasurer does. Explain a little bit about how that performance has turned around, how you've been able to make our pension system perform better for the state of Connecticut.
Sure. So again, we're long-term investors. So our goal is to make sure that we're able to perform over market cycles, right? But we have seen in the short term, we have seen performance improve. This calendar year 2023, we performed at 12.8%, which put us in the top 27% of our peers in terms of folks with similar opportunity sets across the country. And it's because of this work. It's a really talented investment team. We have across the office really committed public servants who could be off doing a lot of different things. likely making a lot more money, but they're committed to the work. They're committed to performing on the behalf of taxpayers. We've paid at the end of this year will be over $8 billion of additional contributions into our pension fund, really making up for this hole of unfunded liability that we dug for ourselves for decades and decades and decades. And again, working collaboratively with the legislature, we're doing a lot to streamline the portfolio to make it a lot more efficient, reducing the number of managers, investing, kind of scaling up with managers we have high conviction in, which allows us to reduce fees and get the best kind of economies of scale. And so there still is a lot of work to do. The asset allocation for us is the biggest indicator of performance. And so just to kind of put that in, simplify it a little bit, asset allocation, if you think about our full portfolio, we invest in real assets and infrastructure and private equity and public equities, fixed income. Your asset allocation is what percentage of each asset class makes up your total portfolio. And with the change in asset class, that guides about 90+% of your performance. And so a lot of work had been done to put that new asset allocation in place. And then you, over a 5-year window, really trying to catch up to that asset allocation as we're deploying capital into those asset classes.
The last one of these conversations I did was down in Stanford with the Attorney General, William Tong. And he talks an awful lot about how so much of the work that he does is getting together with other attorneys general. Socially, they go out to dinner, they hatch plans, and then they go and sue the pants off of a tobacco companies or something. Do you do the same thing? I mean, do you work with other state treasurers on any of these things? And to that end, could more states working together in unison help to maybe get at some of the deeper issues that we started our conversation with? Absolutely.
So work very closely. I'm on the board of directors for the National Association of State Treasurers. So we have regular meetings where we are talking about whether it's investment strategy or, our office also oversees all of the state's bonded debt. So bonding programs, things that help families like our CHET 529 college savings programs, or ABLE, which helps folks with disability save. So we get together often. There are many treasurers that I've gotten close to and that I call on for advice and that have been incredibly helpful. And we do know that, right, as we talk about the ability to use our assets to influence companies and to drive good corporate governance practices or social practices, leveraging our $56 billion is one thing. If you're bringing together 15 states across the country and you are now talking about hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, there's a lot more pressure that gets put on many of these companies. I think one thing that's hard is that the Office of Treasurer is not one of the most political offices, and it's the same thing really across the country. We've seen things, I think, be a lot more politicized in recent years with this kind of
really?
Exactly. I'm sure no one has experienced that or kind of picked up on it, but there is, I think, even as we talk about ESG and a lot of this pushback, or things that, risk factors around corporate governance that were never an issue for decades, now have become these political wedge issues. And we found that being able to work collaboratively has really helped in moving those causes forward.
Okay, so we've done a very hard half hour of just like asking you about these difficult things, and I'm going to get back to more of those things, but I'm going to give you a break for a second I would like to learn a little bit more about you.
Sure.
So we're here on the green in New Haven. This is your town. How did New Haven shape you?
Ooh, that's a good question. Completely. New Haven is, my parents moved here. My dad is originally from Nashville, Tennessee. Dad turned 82 last month. He was a paratrooper in Vietnam, and toward the tail end of his military career was stationed in Germany, where he met my mother, who grew up there. And they got married in Germany. My older brother was born in Germany, and then they moved to Connecticut, in large part because my dad had one friend in New Haven, and being an interracial couple at the time, did not want to move back south where he grew up. And so they came here with little to nothing, and my dad rented out a little storefront in a tough area of the city and started making hot dogs and hamburgers on a griddle, and spent hours in the store and slowly built it up into a small convenience store. And I grew up working in that store from the time I was about 6 years old, standing on a milk crate, doing the cash register, sweeping the floor, stocking shelves, whatever really needed to be done. But it's where I learned so much about community. Lived around a lot of really hardworking people that were just struggling to make ends meet, and we were kind of the community hub in a way. We knew everyone in the neighborhood. It was a place where we heard a lot about the challenges that people were facing. And I was, through my parents' sacrifice, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college and then went to law school. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but those experiences always really guided me in wanting to do something positive and to make sure that I actually stayed in New Haven and was active in the community, because there were plenty of people who were successful coming out of neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, but you didn't always see them there, or they didn't come back. And so the examples of possibility and opportunity weren't always readily available. So I think all of these experiences, right? I think it's shaped me in a huge way.
Is that convenience store still here? Is it still around?
They don't own the store anymore now.
Yeah.
So there still is a store in the original location, on Congress Avenue.
Do you drop by ever?
I do. Yeah. I do. It's right on Congress and Redfield here in New Haven. And so we were there, and then my parents, after they left there, had a small convenience store on Dixwell Avenue in New Hallville. So
hey. Yeah. Hey, sir, I literally asked him that question as the first thing. And so we had a chance to talk about that. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Thank you very much for coming. I just want to talk to him about some other things as well. I appreciate it. So when you took office, you became the first Black LGBTQ person in American history to win an election for statewide office. So I just want to say that again. You were the first in American history to do that. That's kind of remarkable. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, if you ever sit back and think how freaking remarkable that is.
To me, it was startling. So I wasn't made aware of it. I was endorsed by an organization that supports LGBTQ candidates running across the country. And they actually, after I was endorsed, kind of notified me of the potential for that to be history making. And I was surprised in many ways, because you would think at this point that things like this have happened. At the same time, I think it's a signal of how much more work there is to do. But it's an honor. Not so much because it's about me. I think it's the acknowledgement of the folks whose shoulders I stand on in running. I think about people like Joe Graybars, who was the first legislator to come out in Connecticut, or mentors of mine, Mike Lawler and Andrew McDonald, who came out and did the work around the LGBTQ community when it was a lot harder to do it, right? And it was a lot more challenging. And what I find most rewarding about it now is the young folks that I see, or the parents that reach out and say that, their child, it was inspired by the fact that I was able to come up and run. I think the other thing it says is a lot about Connecticut. We've led the way on LGBTQ issues. Happy Pride, everyone. We're still in June here. But we've led the way on LGBTQ issues across the country. And I think what I was most rewarding was through this campaign process and through the election, that folks ultimately made the decision that they were going to support people for their ideas and their ability to do the job and their qualifications. And actually that we were celebrated and embraced. I couldn't imagine running for office publicly when I was in high school, let alone doing it alongside my husband. So it's certainly an honor and also an obligation to make sure that you do well in the role and continue to move the cause forward.
I guess I wonder, though, how that part of your identity, because that is a part of your identity, is not all of you, how that informs the way you think about the work that you do. Like, how much do you say, because I have this, I don't know if it's a burden, but this title, this is something that I did that is a part of who I am. How much do you say, well, okay, I need to use that somehow in the work that I do?
So I think coming from any marginalized community, I think you have a stronger understanding of folks who are not always in the room, right? And folks whose voices are not always heard. And I think I bring that perspective to this role from a lot of different spaces. Two, I think there's this obligation to make sure that you are opening doors and reaching back to pull other people along with you. And then three, I think there's, again, a lot of these issues, if you don't have people with different experiences and with diversity and thought and perspective at the table, policy doesn't change. I think we've made a lot of progress. If you look at our legislature becoming more diverse, a lot of our decision makers coming from spaces that they didn't always we didn't always see represented. I think that is really important, and I try to bring that perspective to these rooms when I'm in them.
Since we're talking about not just divestment, but we're talking about how we can use Connecticut's hard-earned dollars to invest in certain things and not invest in other things. How much do you think about that? I mean, there are some companies, there are some state actors who are unfriendly to the LGBTQ community. There are some state actors, there are some companies that are unfriendly to Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think about that when you think about who we're going to invest in?
That we do. Again, is a lot of the ESG. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of survey as part of our due diligence process as well. And we all ask these questions to managers and companies that we're investing in. We want to know what they're doing around these issues. We want to make sure that they are keeping issues around equity and inclusion and at the forefront of the work, not only because it's the right thing to do, but as we also talk about making investment decisions, we know that diverse companies, we know that diverse boards perform better. We know that diverse managers perform better. I mean, that is a statistically factual piece of information. And so definitely something that we're looking at, that we continue to look at. We engage with folks that we are doing business with around that.
Okay, so that's another way in which you feel like if you're invested in a company, you have an opportunity to stand up as a major investor and actually make change at the corporate level.
Yeah, and part of it is asking questions, right? A lot of times, so historically, people didn't ask what the makeup or the racial makeup of your organization was, or the gender diversity within your organization. Asking those questions, because whether it's because people are doing it for the right reason or they're thinking about it from a business perspective, it has helped to move the needle. Denise Napier really led the charge on this many years ago, before many public pension plans were doing it. And you have now seen a lot of work. This is another area where collaboration with other treasurers across the country has been really effective in moving the needle. Okay,
so I want to get to some more questions that the members have. I want to put a finer point on the thing that we started with, because I want to loop back to this. A few of our questioners who wrote in, and somebody who just stood up and shouted at us, said that you have the ability unilaterally to divest from Israel, to essentially not have Connecticut be in the Israel business anymore. We were talking a bit backstage. It's not so simple, I don't believe, but you can explain it, that it's not something you can do unilaterally. I'd like to understand that a little bit better.
Sure. So again, there's a robust process to all of this. And there are calls for me to completely divest from a lot of things on a very regular basis. Our policy has always been that we go through a robust process. At any time that we have just completely divested from a country, there has been federal guidance on that, and there's been a robust due diligence process or a legislative process.
What does the legislative process look like? Just so I understand that. So, like, what do they have to do to make this work for you?
Yeah, if you look at our policy around divestment from Iran or Sudan, for example, that is there was legislation passed through the Connecticut legislature surrounding that policy. That was not something that was just unilaterally done by the treasurer. And I think it's important that we have process here, and that if there wants to be if the legislature wants to have a conversation around making a decision that we are going to divest from another country, then that process should play out. Again, the only direct investment that we have in Israel right now are 2 Israeli bonds that are set to mature in the next few years. Outside of that, these investments are mostly in companies that outside managers have made determinations are good for pensioners. So maybe a tech company or a software company, but those are not things that we are actively making a decision on a day-to-day basis.
Last question around this. So we've divested from gun manufacturers that make commercial weapons for people. We have a lot, however, in the state of companies that make, for lack of a better word, weapons of war. We are a defense contracting state. Mm-hmm. In many ways, those companies have some risk attached to them as well. In many ways, they are very controversial, because a lot of people believe that is, essentially directly investing in the death of humans, be that in Ukraine, in Palestine, in any place around the world, in Sudan. So the question is, should we be in the business in Connecticut of supporting people who make weapons of war?
So again, I have a fiduciary obligation to maximize return for pensioners. And I think if we get into some of this mindset that we're looking at anything wrong that's happening in any country across the world or any industry, we wouldn't be invested in anything, right? I mean, we would have to look ourselves in the mirror around a lot of these same issues. But my job is to make sure that we are growing our pension fund for state employees and teachers and retirees. And that really is what guides our work at the forefront. Now, again, we engage on a very regular basis to make sure that companies we're doing business with have the best possible practices. And a lot of that is about mitigating risk. But all of this is a cost-benefit analysis as we are doing this work.
I appreciate your time on this. We got a couple more questions from people on various topics. Connecticut cities and towns, someone writes, vary greatly in their economic vitality. What role do you see in the state treasurer's office playing in supporting economic development in under-resourced communities?
Yep.
And how are you working to ensure equitable access to financial resources across the state?
Sure. So great question. And we're doing a lot of work on this front. So some it's supporting municipalities and things like our short-term investment fund. So we manage all of the state's cash and that's on hand, and we invest that so that we're getting returns and building that cash base. We also do that on behalf of municipalities. So getting strong returns for the cash that they're holding for us. So there's very basic kind of technical things like that. But there's also this opportunity to influence larger scale economic policy. So programs like Connecticut Baby Bonds, which is a first in the nation program that we were able to successfully pass and fund here in Connecticut, which is ultimately about addressing cycles of generational poverty in our state. So Connecticut, one of the wealthiest states in the country, but we also have one of the largest wealth gaps, and it's one that has continued to widen over time. And with the passage of this program now, for every child who is born into poverty, so if their birth is covered by Husky, our state's Medicaid program, there's automatically $3,200 invested in a trust on behalf of that child. And we manage that money, and it grows over the life of that individual. And when they're between the ages of 18 and 30, they can access those resources for initiatives that are all about wealth building. So they can purchase a home here in Connecticut, start or invest in a Connecticut business, help pay for post-secondary education or job training, or roll into a retirement savings account. And it's huge, right? We know that these resources not only give these children an opportunity to levels the playing field and creates opportunity that they probably could not have imagined otherwise. But these are all resources that are going to be reinvested back into our communities, largely into communities that have been under-resourced historically. And so we work very collaboratively with the legislature around that initiative. We are constantly looking for ways to move the needle. And it's obviously a strong passion of mine, just based on my experience growing up in Connecticut.
As you explained the baby bonds program, and I think I first heard about this years and years ago, long before the state ever implemented such a thing, all I can think is, why the hell did it take us so long to come up with that idea? It seems to make sense. So why the hell did it take us so long to come up with that idea?
So the concept was developed by an economist named Derek Hamilton, and it has actually been proposed on the federal level. Senator Cory Booker and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. It was obviously took a lot of time and energy to get this accomplished here in Connecticut, and with a lot of collaboration from a lot of different folks. I think one thing that I love about this office is that it is really focused on the long-term future of our state. It's not a job where it's just about one election cycle or one budget cycle. Many of the investments that we're making won't bear fruit until 5 or 7 or 10 years down the road sometimes. And what I think is hard in government and what's hard in political offices is that most folks are encouraged to make decisions thinking about the short term. I think it's what's created many of the fiscal challenges that we've had, is that folks were kicking the can because they weren't going to have to deal with the problem. This says a lot about Connecticut, that folks were willing to step up and make this significant investment in the future of our state, in young people, right? Understanding that I will not likely be in office, and many of the folks that were in the legislature and involved in this won't be in office at the time that this ultimate benefit gets paid out. But I think we have to start to think about our future a little bit more long term. We can't continue to make short term decisions and expect that we're going to get different results long term.
Okay, so, but then as you say that, I mean, what those of us who followed state government, for instance, for years have been thinking is, why can't we think longer term than just 2 years down the road and 2 years down the road? Why 2 years? Because that's how long it takes me to get elected again and be in office for 30 years or however long some people are in office. Do you believe that this is the sort of thing that actually gets people in the legislature and others in state government thinking more long term about something that might happen past, God forbid, my political career ending?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that we've done. We made a lot of progress as a state, and I give the legislature and the governor a lot of credit for the work that's being done to right many of the wrongs that we've seen. A lot of the mismanagement that's happened over many decades, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, right? But if you look at, I mean, I think funding our pensions is the biggest example of that. We went 70 years without putting in the money that we should have, and we'd be in a completely different place had we done that over time. But I do think that there's been this renewed culture of fiscal discipline and addressing many of the longstanding challenges we've had, not going back to that same mentality. We've seen it with the fiscal guardrails, which, of course, there's different opinions about effectiveness and obviously understanding some of the maybe challenges short term that they have created. But big picture, no one can argue the benefits that we've seen as a result of them as well. Balanced budgets, record surpluses. We have a full rainy day fund, which will be at about $4 billion at the close of this fiscal year. We've paid down over close to $8 billion in unfunded pension liability. This discipline, I think, is putting us on the track to really put ourselves in a different space. And we've seen that not just by me saying it or the governor saying it. Our credit ratings have increased dramatically, right? Which is allowing us to invest in people in our state at a much lower cost to taxpayers. And so there's still much work to do, but I do think that there has been in the legislature, in government, a very different approach to how we are governing.
I talked with Governor Lamont as part of the series about those fiscal guardrails. And I think one of the issues that a lot of people bring up is that yes, indeed, this discipline has gotten us to a point where we have surpluses in a place where we used to have deficits. But, you know, it's not a very big state, but somewhere it's raining for somebody, right? If we got a rainy day fund, there's somebody who needs something. And there's an awful lot of agencies that rely on state funding to provide critical social services that say, look, this austerity in their minds isn't letting us get the services that we need right now, and we actually have the money to do it. And so how do you square those things?
Yeah, it's a balancing act, and I think the governor and the legislature have had these conversations and will continue to. I think that they've worked incredibly well in moving things forward. We just renewed the guardrails last year on an almost unanimous basis, right? And so the legislature has made that decision. But I don't think that the fiscal guardrails were meant to be completely static. And I think there's something that we will be looking at. I do think that from the perspective that there will always be a need to have some type of guardrail in place, because I think that is what has incentivized people to not just think about short-term benefits, right? And listen, under these guardrails, if we were not digging ourselves out of such a big hole, there would be a ton of resources to go around without having to pay down these unfunded liabilities and right many of the wrongs of the past. I think the positive thing is we are now in a place where we're able to weigh these things out and actually make decisions about how much we should be paying down debt, how much of our money we need to have in a rainy day fund compared to how much we need to invest in people right now. Whereas 5 or 6 years ago, we were jumping from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis and had no control over it because we didn't have any of these parameters in place, and we didn't have any of the resources to actually just function on a very basic level.
Can I just loop back to the baby bonds program very quickly? At the time that this was getting ready to launch, it faced some opposition from Governor Lamont. It nearly kind of scuttled the whole thing. How have you worked with Governor Lamont on this particular issue? What have your conversations with him been about baby bonds?
Yeah, so it was interesting because I hadn't actually been in office yet when this started to really stir up in a public way. But the governor and I worked very collaboratively on getting this over the finish line. As the governor will tell you, it was I think the day after we were elected, I called him and said, after the congratulations, I know this isn't your issue, but I'm committed to it and look forward to working together as we move forward. And he continuously came to the table as we were looking at addressing many of the concerns that he had to make sure that the program was the best it could be and that we were funding it in the most cost-effective way. And so my team and I went through a lot of work to come up with innovative ways to finance the program, to make sure we were building it out in the best way possible, and ultimately found a way to do that saved about $200 million off the top of the program, didn't require us to borrow any money to fund the program. So we saved about $150 million in borrowing costs. And it didn't impact the budget. And after sitting down, the governor was on board. And I think he's very supportive of the program. I think he understands the opportunity that this creates for young people. He understands the long-term investment in our state and the impact that it really can have moving forward.
Okay, so I have one more question that came in. It came in from a reader, but it's probably a pretty close reader to the Connecticut Mirror. It says, your predecessor and you have both tried to make improvements to the state's unclaimed property program after reporting raised questions about this program. Yet people continue to email the Connecticut Mirror saying they can't get their money back from the state. So first of all, what exactly did you do to try to help and solve the problems with the unclaimed property program? And then why can't people still get their money?
Yeah, so this is something that was very much a focus coming in, and we've done a lot of work on this front, and we're processing more claims and getting more money out the door than ever before. Just to kind of give you some context on how this works. So everyone should go to ctbiglist.com if you have not, to check if you have any unclaimed property. You can file your claim there. But as these claims come in, the process previously was you would submit a claim. You had to provide identifying information because we have to safeguard this money too to make sure it's going back to the right individuals. And then we had to have someone manually process every single claim that came into the office. So it didn't matter if it was for 50 cents or for $50,000, right? And it was the same process. What we've done a lot of work around is really improving technology so that we can automatically process many of the more mundane claims where there's a lot of matching identifying information, and that our team could actually spend time on the more complicated, complex matters. And so we've implemented some of that technology. There still is additional components that we are putting in place that will continue to help us turn over some of those claims and free up staff in the office. But we are also doing work legislatively, right? Some of the challenges is how to match up information, or if we have, so for example, someone files their taxes with DRS and we have your information, we could very easily match that with unclaimed property, except that we don't have authority to do that, to share that information. And so we've been working with the legislature to really improve that process, to improve some of the data sharing information with our ultimate goal of getting more money back to people more quickly. So it's a process, and we continue to plug away at it. We're certainly making progress, and we're hoping that we're turning claims around a lot faster. But there are still hurdles, both legislatively to how we can go about that process, and just from a staff and technology perspective.
Okay, what's the worst part of your job? The best part of your job?
I think best part of my job is the people I get to work with every day. I am fortunate to work with folks that are incredible public servants that, again, could be out doing a lot of different things, particularly in the finance space. The office is really broad, right? So cash, debt, our investments, economic policy, Chet, baby bonds, right? But having a team of folks that are dedicated to the work that they're doing, many folks that have spent decades doing it, is really, really rewarding. The tough part is sometimes the politics, right? I think the role in a lot of the work is not hyper political. And I obviously understand that I am elected and in a political office, and that that comes with the territory. But any attempts are when there are things that are where politics are getting in the way of the ability to actually perform well and do the work. It can be frustrating at times.
But I watched you talk in person with a lot of the folks who were here at this event in advance, and you're not running for anything right now, but it seems as though you kind of feel comfortable. You must like just talking with people, even if they don't agree with what you're doing.
Oh, interacting with people is not the politics that I'm talking about. I love interacting with the public, and one thing that I have wanted to do, and I hope that we're accomplishing that, is really connect this work to people, everyday people. Most folks have no idea what the treasurer does or how it impacts their lives on a daily basis or why it's important. And this is a critical office to the future of the state and to how people live their lives and the resources that are available, and finding savings and creating policy that saves taxpayer dollars. And, so we do a lot of work out in the community, speaking to folks. We want to know what's important to people. And so that part of the role I love. I think there are, challenges sometimes around wanting to educate folks about the full process. And then as we think about policy and legislation, making sure that it's actually most beneficial to the work that we're doing.
State Treasurer Erick Russell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'd like very much to thank the International Festival of Arts and Ideas for helping to coordinate this event and providing us with this lovely space. Special thanks to our sponsors, Mohegan Tribe, Connecticut Business and Industry Association, Eversource, Clifton Larson Allen, the Causeway Agency, Express Agencies, Hinckley Allen, and Rowthorne Law. Thanks to everyone at the Connecticut Mirror.